like to thank everyone for coming, especially the students. We are now in the end of the semester, so we have many tests now, so we have not so much people here, but we can be sure that the students that are here, everyone is very important. Okay? I would like to thank Silvio and the organization of this conference, if I can say. And it's very important to us to receive in our university the International Herbert Marcuse Society and the thinkers of so many other parts of the world. Especially because I don't know if the Dialectics know, but our university is one of the last public university where the students don't pay anything to study here, and this is very special. We have no support this moment. We are in a very difficult moment to the financiation of our work. So all of what we do here is with so many hope, so many energy, and it's very special to us to have thinkers like you here with us. So it's very special. Thank you very much. And I would like to, another thing that I think that's very important, our students are the children of the labor movement of Brazil. So I don't know quantos de vocês, os pais foram metalúrgicos aqui. How many of you, the father was an activist in the labor movement in Brazil? So it's very interesting to have Marcuse thinkers this moment to us. So I would like to present one of the very special professors that learned Marcuse to us, Professor Arnold Farr. Thank you very much. Arnold Farr is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kentucky. His research interests are German idealism, critical theory, Marxism, African philosophy, psychoanalysis, postmodernism, and liberation philosophy. He is co-editor and a co-author of Marginal Groups and the Mainstream American Culture, this is the title, and author of Critical Theory and Democratic Vision, Herbert Marcuse, and Recent Liberation Philosophies. He is co-editor of Critical Refusions, Herbert Marcuse and Contemporary Social Movements, a double special issue of the Radical Philosophy Review. It's very nice to quote because we can put in our references. He's the founder and serves on the board of the International Herbert Marcuse Society, and as I could see with my eyes, a very great play of blues.
I'm not sure if I need this. Anybody having trouble hearing me? I project rather well, I think. We should listen.
Is it necessary for the...
Yeah, but they can't.
I think if you speak loudly enough.
I just maybe put on the table so it faces you.
Okay, maybe we can. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Elena, for an introduction. And thanks to Silvio and all the organizers of this conference. I did the Zoom session yesterday. I sat in on that. Was very inspired by the papers there and also by the papers that was given here today. So thank you again for being here. This little presentation is experimental. And you're my guinea pigs, and I'm trying out some new ideas in you, and we'll see how that goes. So, of course, the focus is Marcuse's Counterrevolution and Revolt, but I've also, toward the end of the paper, I bring in Paul Ricoeur to put in conversation with Marcuse, his notion of narrative identity that I get from the works of Paul Ricoeur. Interestingly, the last session had a discussion on Marcuse's pessimism and optimism, and the first section of this paper is entitled The Dialectic of Optimism and Realism in Marcuse's Counterrevolution and Revolt. From time to time, as one hears conversations about the work of Herbert Marcuse, one is struck by the oversimplification of his work. On the basis of a superficial reading, there are those who argue that Marcuse was a pessimist, while others argue that he was an optimist. Both interpretations are due to the fact that Marcuse never gave up hope for the development of revolutionary subjectivity among oppressed people. This gives birth to the view that Marcuse was optimistic. However, Marcuse was always aware of the development of social mechanisms that were designed to prohibit the development of critical or revolutionary consciousness. It is my view that in Marcuse's work, there is no opposition between pessimism and realism. Between pessimism and optimism. Instead, in Marcuse's work, we find a dialectic of realism and optimism. Marcuse's optimism lies in his refusal to abandon the quest for revolutionary subjectivity and his ability to recognize the objective conditions for revolution. His realism is rooted in his ability to recognize the development of oppressive and repressive and counter-revolutionary forces, along with potentially revolutionary conditions. In fact, any social theory that fails to recognize the development of counter-revolutionary forces, even in the midst of objective revolutionary conditions, will fail in the development of an adequate transformative strategy for liberation. Before I go any further, I want to examine a passage from Douglas Carter's classic book, Herbert Marcuse and the Crisis of Marxism. In this passage, Kellner briefly discusses the difference between one-dimensional man and counter-revolutionary revolt. He writes, Counter-revolution and revolt represents an important development in Marcuse's analysis of capitalist society and strategy for social transformation. Whereas one-dimensional man portrays a society of total integration grounded in consumer needs, he now argues that society of happy consumers is disintegrated and the needs themselves are a source of mounting frustration as the rising expectations of commodity paradise are unfulfilled for the underlying majority. Whereas in one-dimensional man, Marcuse stresses the tendencies toward the integration of the working class into the labor system and place of work. He now emphasizes the disintegrating tendencies in the production system itself and argues that the base of exploitation and reservoir of dissatisfaction is expanding to include the majority of the underlying population. Consequently, whereas in one-dimensional man, Marcuse only saw potential opposition in non-integrated outsiders or radical students and intellectuals, he now perceives a greatly expanded base for opposition and struggle. So this is in quotes. When Kellner mentions the opposition in non-integrated outsiders, Marcuse in Counter-Revolutionary Revolt and in Essay on Liberation talks about catalyst groups, where he's looking for groups in a way kind of not outside of the working class, but not the type of working class that Marx had in mind. Where he talks about the feminist movement and the struggle for black liberation, so on and so forth, and the student revolts. Okay. For some, a one-dimensional man seems to reek with pessimism, as Marcuse was preoccupied with the many social mechanisms that whittle down or prohibit the development of critical or revolutionary consciousness. The optimism lies in this hope that non-integrated outsiders will form pockets of resistance to the developing forces of oppression. Hence, Marcuse always hoped for the development of revolutionary subjectivity. In later writings, such as his lecture on Beyond One-Dimensional Man and his book An Essay on Liberation, Marcuse examines the possible development of critical consciousness in those who are not a part of the underlying population. That is, at one level, there is a biological level of need that may become a source for resistance. This is the focus of at least one part of An Essay on Liberation. At another level, what we call the working class has become much more complicated than the Marxian view of the working class. The working class is much broader and more complicated than the Marxian industrial proletariat. Further, the contradictions of capitalism have grown to the point of self-destruction of the system. In Counterrevolution and Revolt, Marcuse's optimism lies in his ongoing belief that the possibilities for social change and in the development of revolutionary consciousness. His realism lies in his awareness of the ways in which the establishment continues to produce mechanisms that prohibit the development of revolutionary change. In this paper, I do not plan to merely examine the mechanisms for the containment of social change explored by Marcuse. Instead, I will extend Marcuse's analysis of the counter-revolution by examining a couple of counter-revolutionary ingredients that are not explored by Marcuse. What I hope will be my contribution to our discussion of counter-revolution is Marcusian and Marxian in spirit. In Counterrevolution and Revolt, and many other places as well, Marcuse reminds us that Marxian theory is a historical theory that must constantly be revised in light of new social, economic, political, and historical developments. Peter did this a moment ago. Therefore, I simply want to develop certain Marcusian insights in light of our present political situation. In the next section of this paper, I will briefly establish Marcuse's view of counter-revolution. In the third part, I will introduce the concept of narrative identity as one of the mechanisms that create the conditions for the prohibition of the development of revolutionary consciousness and activity. In the fourth and final part, which is actually not the final part, but in the fourth part of this paper, I will examine the combined roles of narrative identity, fantasy, and fear in perpetuating the counter-revolution. And so I did have a fifth part that is my attempt at a kind of solution or way out. So I'll read that later. We'll talk about whether it's really fantasy or not. So part two, the dialectic of revolution and counter-revolution. The term counter-revolution is an odd term to use in a social and political context where there's been no revolution. In Marcuse's text, the term counter-revolution does not refer to a repressive response or reaction to a revolution. Instead, here the term counter-revolution refers to an anticipatory activity. That is, the counter-revolution is a preemptive strike against the possibility of a revolution. This preemptive strike is a necessary move by the establishment because the establishment has created the necessary and objective conditions for revolution. As the capitalist system generates contradiction after contradiction, it produces its own possible gravediggers. It produces unbearable conditions which can no longer be tolerated by the growing mass of victims. A revolutionary response by the people must be anticipated and disrupted before it can take root in the consciousness of the people. Marcuse reminds us that even though the objective conditions for revolution exist, the subjective conditions for revolution not yet developed. Capitalism as a system knows no boundaries. It stretches its tentacles in every corner of life. It must make promises to the working class that it then refuses to fulfill. Eventually, these conditions become unlivable, or so it seems. One of Marcuse's main claims in Counterrevolution and Revolt is that the expanding and more complicated working class, combined with the intensifying contradictions of capitalism, have created the conditions for revolution. However, as the conditions for revolution develop, so does counter-revolutionary forces. For now, let's take a brief look at a couple of claims about more recent objective conditions for revolution with regards to the expanding working class. And this is a quote from Marcuse in Counterrevolution and Revolt. Marcuse says, "The unproductive intelligentsia enjoys a greater freedom of movement than the productive laborer. And yet, the separation from control over the means of production defines the common objective condition of the wage and salary earners, the condition of exploitation. They reproduce capital. The extensions of exploitation to a larger part of the population, accompanied by a high standard of living, is the reality behind the facade of the consumer society. This reality It's a unifying force which integrates behind the back of the individuals and widely different conflicting classes of the underlying population. Okay, the intelligentsia, this is the end quote. The intelligentsia, who enjoys a greater freedom of movement than the laborer, still live under the same objective conditions insofar as the intelligentsia and the laborer have no control over the means of production. We can see this in many of our universities where certain mechanisms from outside of the university are capable of manipulating university officials. These mechanisms or forces often determine the kind of funding our universities get. In the US, there have been many attempts by owners of big businesses to influence the curriculum taught in our universities. Education is often reduced to the acquisition of a skill set for the sake of joining in on capitalist reproduction. More and more, education as building the cultivation of the self and one's critical capacity is put under erasure, hence the defunding, gradual defunding of art and humanities. Critical consciousness is whittled down instead of being developed. In the above passage, it is implied that at some level, capitalism is a unifying force to the extent that it brings together under one umbrella of domination a diversity of groups that include the intelligentsia and the labor. However, this process of unification is at the same time a process of disintegration. Marcuse writes, this unifying force remains a force of disintegration. The total organization of society under monopoly capitalism and the growing wealth created by this organization can neither undo nor arrest the dynamic of its growth. Capitalism cannot satisfy the needs which it creates. The rising standard of living itself expresses this dynamic. It enforced the constant creation of needs that could be satisfied on the market. It is now fostering transcendent needs which cannot be satisfied without abolishing the capitalist mode of production. It is still true that capitalism grows through growing impoverishment, and that impoverishment would be the basic factor of revolution, although in new historical forms. End quote. As capitalism unifies various groups under its desired reality principle, it also creates disintegration within the allegedly unified individuals. This disintegration is a new form of alienation where needs develop that are beyond mere material needs. These transcending needs are material and non-material hopes that are instilled in the people. These are hopes that can never be fulfilled by the present order of things. Bill Keller writes regarding this. He says, talking about Marcuse, he suggests that the system implants needs for freedom, individuality, and happiness that it cannot fulfill. The ideologies of advanced capitalism that promote personal gratification and fulfillment are becoming, Marcuse believes, increasingly contradictory and subversive of the system itself. But to the extent that these ideologies cannot be realized, they too promote frustration and revolt. Marcuse believes that these transcendent needs can help produce the ability to see through capitalism's ideological veil and see into its damning contradictions. So notice these new needs he's talking about, freedom, individuality, happiness, so on and so forth. Those also will be features of national narratives and narrative identity that I'll talk about later. Capitalist exploitation keeps itself alive by making promises that it cannot keep. The demand for life beyond the confines of capitalism is produced by capitalism itself. Hence, the necessity, by necessity, capitalism produces grounds for revolution. However, what develops instead is revolt, which is a critical response to capitalism, but not revolutionary transformation. The discontent produced by new levels of capitalist exploitation and failed promises has an organized character. Given this, Marcuse says, the potential mass base for social change may well become the mass base for fascism. We may well be the first people to go fascist by the democratic vote. The relation between liberal democracy and fascism has found the shortest and most striking formulation in the phrase, liberal democracy is the face of the property classes when they are not afraid, fascism when they are afraid, end quote. Recent political events and upheavals in the US and Brazil and in other places of the world reveal to us the potential for fascism that Marcuse speaks of. However, the election of Joe Biden in the US and Lula in Brazil, with the election of Joe Biden and Lula in Brazil, we have at least put in place two governments that may turn our countries away from possible fascism, turn our countries away from the possible fascism to which they appear to be headed under Bolsonaro and Trump. However, I'm not sure what Brazil's future holds with Lula, but I can say with some certainty that the US is not headed toward socialism or any significant social change. Also, it seems to me that the rise to power of Trump and Bolsonaro indicates a fundamental problem in the social, economic, and political landscape of both countries. In the US, it is clear to me that Trump is not the cause of social and political unrest, but rather the symptom. Further, the destructive and oppressive tendencies in the population released by leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro are still with us and could strike at any time. People become even more fascistic. With the growing potential to end economic exploitation and the refusal to do so, the conditions for revolution ripen as fruit on the tree. Indeed, the property class has much to fear, and they have responded and are still responding. Many of us in the U.S. fear that the violence that erupted at our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, may be only the beginning of a trend of violence. Indeed, the working class in America have been duped into taking up arms to protect the billionaire class. That's funny, isn't it? Somehow, they have identified with their oppressors, and the working class revolution that we may have hoped for has become a counter-revolution by the working class for the sake of the capitalist class. In Counterrevolution and Revolt, Marcuse examines the development of the objective conditions for revolution and the ongoing counter-revolutionary response. He examines the role of the New Left and its potential failure as a response to capitalist oppression. With regards to a solution, Marcuse gestures toward political education. I will say more about this later. At this point, we gestures toward political education and also art. At this point, I want to transition to another thinker who has provided us with certain theoretical tools that might help bring a bit more clarity to our present situation. Well, Ricoeur, these tools may bring a bit more clarity, but Ricoeur himself is not clear. Very, very difficult to read. That thinker is a French philosopher called Ricoeur. It is true that Ricoeur does not belong to the radical or Marxist tradition, and many will question my attempt to put him in conversation with Marcuse. I've been questioned before. However, before I discuss Ricoeur's contribution, I need to remind us of a few things. Although Marcuse believed that Marxian theory was fundamentally correct, it did and does have some shortcomings. Further, Marxism is a historical theory and must be developed as our historical situation changes. This is the point Peter made earlier. Therefore, it was in the spirit of Marx that Marcuse and other members of the Frankfurt School could enlist Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, Heidegger, and others as they developed their form of critical theory. My own work has been fueled by a need to put Marcuse in conversation with several other important contemporary thinkers. I'm also reminded here of Silvio's wonderful dissertation on Marcuse and Foucault, and now Lacan is part of the picture. I'm also influenced by Ricoeur's own dialectical method of reading the history of philosophy. Ricoeur's method is to put two or more philosophers in conversation with each other and let them disclose the limits of each other's philosophies. It is in this conversation between two or more philosophers that the limits and the strengths of each philosophy is revealed. For the purpose of this paper, I will explore Ricoeur's notion of narrative identity as one possible way of explaining counter-revolution. One more note of caution. While Ricoeur was concerned with the matter of justice in some texts, these issues were not central to his philosophy. My strategy here is to extrapolate from his philosophy some important theoretical tools that we may give a revolutionary mission to within a Marxian or Marcusian framework. This is similar to the way in which Marcuse and other members of the Frankfurt School appropriated the works of many other philosophers and writers who were not themselves revolutionary. Part 3, narrative identity and the formation of consciousness. In this section and the next, I will examine narrative identity, fantasy, and fear as new ingredients in a counter-revolution. And I refer to them as new ingredients, but they're not really new ingredients. They're new in terms of being theorized in a Marcusian framework, but as you'll see as I begin to talk about narrative identity, that narrative identity is something that happens at the beginning, even at the formation of a society, right? And so I think Silvio said something earlier about the counter-revolution always being with us, being kind of permanent, right? Well, I support that view, that it's permanent, but my paper doesn't deal with the permanency of it. It deals with it in terms of origin. And once you can sort of locate something like counter-revolution at the very beginning of a society, right? You can then see how those mechanisms that are at the foundation of society, of origin of society, can manifest and transform themselves as that society develops, and even as revolutionary movements develop in given societies. Okay, now I think I've got my place. Yeah. All right. Okay, so I've just said all of this. Okay, so my attempt to expand the framework of Marcuse's critical theory and revolutionary thought has its origin in two particular problems. First, in all his work, Marcuse searched for the possibility of the development of radical or critical subjectivity, a radical, critical, or revolutionary subjectivity that would be capable of rising up in a transformative way against the real objective conditions for revolution. This quest for revolutionary or critical subjectivity required recognition at every step of the social, political, economic, historical, and I would add, emotional mechanisms that prohibited the development of revolutionary subjectivity. In Counterrevolutionary Revolt, he highlights at least two distinct possibilities for the development of revolutionary subjectivity. The first is the new left, and the second is art. In these two possibilities, there is a clear hope for revolution. However, the counter-revolutionary forces that develop alongside them has the potential to reduce art and the work of the new left to merely a moment of revolt, which is a critical response without total transformation of capitalist society. I believe that the notion of narrative identity, along with an analysis of fantasy and fear in the development of subjectivity, will help us carry Marcuse's critique of capitalist society a bit further. As most of you know, Marcuse and the Frankfurt School looked to Freudian psychoanalysis to help them understand the social, political, and psychological mechanisms that made the working class complicit in its own oppression. There's an interesting moment in the early pages of One-Dimensional Man where Marcuse attempts to go beyond Freud. He argues that the willing down of critical consciousness was viewed as a result of introjection, whereas members of the working class internalized the beliefs and values of their oppressors, the Freudian superego at this point. The Freudian superego is the internalization of external values created by a larger society. In One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse expresses some doubt about this form of explanation. He argues that this view presupposes an inwardness that is capable of internalizing said values. At this point, he prefers to use the term mimesis, whereby the human person mimics or imitates the oppressor. It seems to me that mimesis has no more explanatory power than introjection. Some of you may disagree, but my worry is deeper than that. It seems to me that whether we prefer introjection or mimesis, the process whereby this occurs is in need of further examination. Also, Ricoeur's theory of narrative identity entails also a theory of mimesis. I will not get into the details of Ricoeur's theory of narrative identity, since he develops his theory within the context of a whole set of philosophical concerns that is not our focus. Ricoeur's theory of narrative identity begins in his three-volume work, Time and Narrative, and continues to develop throughout his writings for decades. In Time and Narrative, he's more concerned with the philosophical treatment of time in Aristotle, Augustine, all the way to Kant and Heidegger and others. However, his approach to the constructive power of narrative is useful for our purposes. In the third chapter of Volume 1 of Time and Narrative, Farr writes, "The moment has come to join together the two independent studies and test my basic hypothesis that between the activity of narrating a story and the temporal character of human experience, there exists a correlation that is not merely accidental, but presents a transcultural form of necessity. Put it another way, time becomes human to the extent that it is articulated through a narrative mode, and narrative attains its full meaning when it becomes a condition for temporal existence." End quote. As temporal beings, we are the creators and products of a narrative process whereby meaning and identity is formed. Time is experienced as action and the interpretation of that action. This all should become clear after a brief examination of the three forms of mimesis explored by Ricoeur. It may not become clear, but that's all right. Human life and its self-understanding are constituted by three forms of mimesis or narration. There are mimesis 1, or prefigured time, mimesis 2, or configured time, and mimesis 3, or refigured time. I will explain each of them. Mimesis 1, or prefigured time, refers to the composition of the plot and is grounded on the pre-understanding of the world of action, its meaning, its meaningful structures, symbolic resources, and temporal character. And here's a short quote from Ricoeur. "The plot of a narrative is comparable to the predicative assimilation. It grafts together and integrates into one whole, a complete story, multiple scattered events, thereby schematizing the intelligible signification attached to the narrative taken as a whole." End quote. According to Ricoeur, human life is taken up and understood in human consciousness as a plot wherein discordance becomes concordance, or the concordance of, let me read that again. Discordance becomes concordance, or scattered events are unified into a single narrative whereby one can understand and organize one's life. I don't think that this point is controversial. I don't know why I said that. It might be controversial. We understand our lives as being constituted by past, present, and projected future. It is one single story made up of many parts that may not have a unity in themselves, but are given a unity by the human agent. I don't want to spend much time on this point, but my concern here is with the plot or identity construction. Mimesis 1, or prefigured time, is similar to what Heidegger and Husserl would call pre-ontological understanding or pre-theoretical understanding. The Heideggerian notion of being thrown into existence is useful here. At birth, this is according to Heidegger, at birth, the individual is thrown into an already established existing web of meaning, norms, values, interpretations. We enter a social world with pre-established meanings and values. It is in this context that consciousness and identity develops. We start life in a world that is not of our own making, but it provides the grounds for self-making. You can also think about Foucault here too. Foucault reverses on the Platonic and Christian idea that the body is the prison of the soul. It says instead that the soul is a prison of the body. And by soul, he's referring to external social values, meanings, interpretation. And at birth, the society literally begins writing on the body. And when I teach this, I often talk about it in terms of gender identification. Whereas we have these categories in our society called masculine and feminine, or male and female, two categories. And at birth, the doctor looks at one's genitalia and assigns a category without any thought of what might be between those two categories or outside of those two categories, right? And so one has a gender assignment from birth, and then is expected to engage in practices that reaffirms that gender assignment. Right? And so again, we're thrown into the world where that already exists, right? So that there's already a narrative about masculinity, a narrative about femininity that we're thrown into, and our lives are given shape, our consciousness develops in the context of those pre-established narratives. Mimesis 2, or configured time, refers to the mediation between events and story. This is a grasping together of the detailed actions of the story or the incidents. If I am asked by a stranger, who am I? I can tell the stranger my name, but I suspect that the stranger is looking for more. I identify myself with a story that includes information about my past, present, and future goals. I present an organized story. I pull together and organize actions, incidents, and events from my life, right? And so part of the configuration is taking what is discordant and making it concordant by pulling it together into a single unified narrative. Where actually, my daily experience may be very disorganized. There may not be a real unity to it, but for me to make sense of life and to project myself into the future, I pull together all of these events and I create a unified story that by some kind of unified identity. Mimesis 3, or refigured time, refers to the intersection of the world of the text and the world of the reader. This is our reading of our own narrative. We could believe that all human life is a text that can be read and interpreted. In my daily living, I write the text that is my life. The writing of this text requires a simultaneous reading and interpreting of this text. If the writing of this text through my actions and the reading and interpreting of this text, in the writing of this text, through my actions and the reading and interpreting of this text, I construct my identity. However, we must keep in mind that the formation of human identity occurs in a particular context that is itself constituted by resources that are not the making of the individual. I can say much more about these three forms of mimesis, but I hope now you have some understanding of what they are and how they work. If not, we can talk about them further in the question and answer period. So now I want to move on to how Ricoeur's insight can be appropriated by critical theory. In yesterday's session, the Zoom session, someone mentioned the lack of a theory of the other or subjectivity in Farr and Marcuse. While Ricoeur does not develop a full theory of intersubjectivity or recognition, he does have a book on recognition. So he does at least one book where he discusses the problem of recognition. So let me start that sentence over. While Ricoeur does not develop a full theory of intersubjectivity or recognition, we can see that the construction of identity requires a social context wherein the resources for self-creation are present. Self-instruction embodies a dialectic between desire and various social ingredients. Even Farr recognized that what we call personality is a result of the way in which we have negotiated desire and social impediments. I've taken a brief detour through Ricoeur for the sake of introducing some ingredients to Counterrevolution not explored by Marcuse. We see in Counterrevolution and Revolt that the Counterrevolution is not a response to an actual revolution. Its function is preventative. However, I want to explore the development of Counterrevolution at a deeper level than Marcuse. I sound weird saying that, but let's just say it. So René Girard makes the claim that every civilization is built on a founding murder. I could give you many examples from his work, but that is not necessary. We need only to look at the founding of the United States as an example. The traditional narrative about the U.S., and you can also, this can be applied to many other countries. You can apply this in some way to Brazil, various nations in Europe. The traditional narrative about the U.S. is that it was founded by a few heroic settlers who were seeking freedom. In this quest for freedom, they discovered a new land where they could form a new society built on freedom, equality, and justice. This is the narrative that one is cast into it forever. It is the narrative that we encounter when we go to school. So an example I often give people is when I was a kid, based in South Carolina, my parents actually went to segregated high school, so they were raised under Jim Crow law in South Carolina. Shortly after I was born, my dad wanted to buy a brand new car. He worked hard for it and made money to buy a brand new car. But my grandfather talked him out of it because at that time in South Carolina, if you were a black person, you were driving a brand new car, you were the uppity Negro. And you were likely to get pulled over by the cops and beaten or killed. So my dad bought a used car instead. So only one black person in my hometown at that time bought a new car, but he never ever drove it. But a few years later, my second grade teacher, every day he'd get in your class and we stand up and we have to put our hands on our heart and recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and then sing My Country 'Tis of Thee. I had no business doing either of those, right? Because they were lies. They weren't true about the reality in which my family lived. And I always tell people my education began with a lie, and more lies preceded, right? So my education began in the form of miseducation. Right? Okay, so let's continue. I get off my horse here. The narrative continues by claiming that the U.S. is an exceptional country where all have equal opportunity. The truth is that the founding of the U.S. is built on the backs and blood of enslaved Africans and Native Americans. So we have a conflict of narratives where one narrative dominates the other or puts the other under erasure. The narrative about the heroic founding of the U.S. and the real narrative of death and bloodshed is the prefigured time into which every American is born. This is the context in which American identity is formed. Hence, at its foundation, the U.S. generates contradictions that must be overcome or managed. My point is that the contradictions that permeate many capitalist societies are there in the formation of these societies. The U.S. in its chosen narrative is already a form of counterrevolution, right? To begin one's education with a lie, it's already to begin to put one's critical consciousness under erasure. Right? It is to make you a good citizen, a nice citizen that fits in with everybody else. You be patriotic, salute the flag, so on and so forth. Don't rock the boat, and just be a good American. So my claim is that although counter-revolutionary forces develop and expand as capitalism develops and expands, it is also the case that the mechanisms that create the conditions for the development of counter-revolutionary forces may be present at the origins of capitalist societies. That is, a society that is founded on contradictions and by its nature generates false narratives by which the identities of people is formed, can very easily continue to generate counter-revolutionary forces and make real social transformative revolution almost impossible. Now keep in mind I said almost impossible, not impossible. From the beginning, American society was built on the dichotomy between the human and the subhuman. The human referred to only a few white males who entered something like a social contract, wherein the vast majority of human beings, Africans, Asians, women, poor whites with no property, were excluded. However, this did not prevent them from using the language of universality, which created the false narrative of inclusion. The overall real narrative becomes one of excluded people fighting for their humanity and inclusion in the social contract. This struggle by excluded people is then manipulated by the establishment. I will say more about this in the next section. So the next section is fantasy, fear, and the development of counter-revolutionary consciousness. One of the functions of national narratives is the construction of fantasy. This is not fantasy, as Marcuse uses the term in Eros and Civilization. There, Marcuse contributes fantasy to a potentially transformative power, as insofar as in fantasy, we imagine a world or form of life that is liberated. In my use of the term, fantasy functions as ideology in the Marxian sense. It is a form of inverted consciousness, of conscious misrepresentation of reality. The fantasy of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, national exceptionalism, the inferiority of other races, inclusion in the social contract, trickle-down economics, the free market, a free country, individual autonomy, etc., blinds us to the real forces of domination that shape our lives. The false narrative that lies at the origin of capitalist society produces fantasies, contradictions, and fears that can be used and manipulated at various historical moments according to the needs of capitalism. Here, I want to say a brief word about fear and then conclude. In America, racial demographics will change greatly in just a couple of decades as white people will become a numerical minority. At the same time as previous minorities increase in population, there's also an increase in power with regards to voting and holding political office by minorities. The 2008 election of the first Black president was an indication that the glass ceiling is vulnerable. These events have created a surge in white fear. The birth of replacement theory and the chant by white supremacists that Jews will not replace us represents the eruption of white fear and anger. Poor working class white people who are victims of capitalism have chosen people of color as their enemy and not capitalism. Indeed, capitalism needs racism for its own survival. And this is way prior to Trump. Before Trump, there were political figures in the US who would speak to rooms of white working class men and who were poor and imply that you are in the situation you're in because unqualified women, whites, and Hispanics are getting your jobs and your promotions. And all they need to do is see one brother in a Cadillac, and it confirms the politician said, right? Forget all the others who live in poverty. White people in the US accepted and identified with the narrative that promised them the world. Instead of being given the world, they have instead not even been given necessary resources for survival, much less the resources for self-development and self-determination. They are now receptive to a narrative that blames present minorities for their problems. What we're experiencing now across the globe is the development of counter-revolutionary forces that has root in the very identity of the people who are in most need of a revolution. They fight for the promise of a national and even religious narrative that was false and contradictory from the beginning. In Counterrevolution and Revolt, Marcuse claims that the present contradictions may lead to socialism or barbarism. I have to admit that barbarism seems most likely. Sorry. However, I don't want to end with this note of pessimism. So in the next section, I'll try to talk myself out of it. So section 5, the last section, is empathy and democratic attunement toward Marcusean discourse ethics and revolutionary practice. And some of you years ago, I don't know where we were in Brazil, and I gave a paper where I talked about democratic attunement. So I've been trying to think through this kind of stuff for some time. So let me just read and say a few things. This section is just a brief reflection on some thoughts that I've had in trying to develop what may at least open the door for some possibilities regarding social change. There are many places in Marcuse's work that seem to call for a form of discourse ethics. There are several places in One Dimensional Man where I have in the margins, I've written Marcusean discourse ethics. In Counter-Revolution and Revolt, he points toward art and education as potential ways of countering counter-revolution. However, both art and education can be used to serve counter-revolutionary forces. A Marcusean discourse ethics is nothing like Habermas's notion of discourse ethics. It does not presuppose an ideal speech situation. Instead, it It begins at the level of what Charles Mills calls non-ideal theory. If you're not familiar with Charles Mills, he just passed away around this time last year, but a very prominent African-American philosopher, does philosophy of race. In many of his works, his big working post is John Rawls. It was an ideal theory where you can go under a veil of ignorance and somehow, once you left your identity outside the door, construct principles of justice that are fair and just for everybody. And this is sort of the trend in Western philosophy. It kind of a view from nowhere, or thinking about justice as a disembodied subject, right? And Mills challenges that view and argues that the real place to begin is from non-ideal theory, real human life as it is lived with its injustices in place. And he writes in one of my favorite books of his, Blackness Visible, he talks about the amount of ink that philosophers have wasted on the question of other minds. How do we know other people exist? How do we know other minds exist? And Charles says, well, if you're oppressed, you know that other minds exist, right? If somebody's foot is on your throat, you have no doubt that that person exists because their foot is on your throat, right? And your only legitimate, you have two legitimate philosophical questions. One, why is his foot on my throat? Two, how in the hell do I get it off, right? And that's what your philosophy begins if you're an oppressed person, all right? Okay, so I'll see all that. So, thinking about a Marcusean type discourse that has to begin by engaging those who suffer. And there's a few things I want to say about this form of engagement. I haven't developed anything like a Marcusean discourse ethics, but I have been thinking seriously about democratic discourse, democratic attunement, and let me say a few things about that. So, those of us on the left often destroy our own projects when it comes to trying to win friends and influence people, right? When we're trying to actually create a political movement that will lead toward liberation. Too often, we're more preoccupied with being theoretically correct than actually having a conversation with people who are suffering. And I've been saying ever since that awful event in 2016, that there are some Trump people you can talk to. A lot of my friends, you can't talk to them, they're all just racist. And a lot of them are racist for sure. Joy Reid, a popular media personality, wrote a book a couple of years ago, and she basically rejects the idea that economic strife plays a role in the attitude of Trump followers. And she's completely wrong, right? She wants to argue that it's all about racism. Some of it is, but a lot of those people are reacting in the way that they are because they are poor, they're suffering, they've not been listened to by either party. Sarah made the point earlier, and she's absolutely right, that during the primary in 2016, there were people, I mean, first of all, there were people who voted for Obama, and then in the primary in 2016, voted for Sanders, and then in the general in 2016, voted for Trump. We have the data in Kentucky. We did the research, and we have the data, right, to show who voted for whom. And the point is that these people were hurting, and for decades, they've been ignored by the Democratic and the Republican Party, because both parties are capitalist parties, right? And so there is something else there. I had the opportunity it was 2018, there's a group in the US called Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice. And it's a group of white people who come together to fight racism by teaching other white people about racism. And I did some work with them for a short while. And we went out canvassing one day. And it's not the kind of canvassing you do when you go door to door to get votes for a political candidate, right? This wasn't about political candidates. We went door to door, asking people questions about their politics, or what kind of problems they were having, or what would they like to see done differently in the city. And we had a conversation. And the conversation led to some of these touchy topics like racism, right? And I remember on one occasion, we were talking to a white man in his front yard, and he began reflecting on a moment when he was a child, and his best friend was a black boy. And he remembered when he got of a certain age, his father told him he couldn't play with that kid anymore. And he started reflecting about how, from that point on, he was shaped by racism. And he cried. He cried once he began to think about the narrative that he brought into it, right? And so that kind of conversation is tough to have, but I think that is necessary. I think on the left, we tend to look at big events, electoral politics only, the big revolution, and I don't know if that's where it's going to happen. But there are other ways. They're tough, they're difficult, they're tricky. I hate canvassing. I just hate it. But somebody's got to do it, right? And so I want to end with this note. The revolution may not take place in the streets or in our educational institutions. It may very well take place in the supermarket, at the coffee shop, in the barber shop, at the dinner table, on a neighbor's doorstep, and in the beauty parlor. Thank you. Okay.
Arnold, very nice. I am very excited with your speech, Arnold. Because I think that you will tell something very important to us here in the university. We are talking between us, we are talking the same frameworks, and we need to go to the supermarket, and there we will not talk as we talk here. And there are something, when you presented the Counterrevolution and Revolt, I remember you remind me the place of nature and the revolution there, and just in the end of this text, Marcuse is very interested in the relation between men and women, and the rest of him that he talked there. But there are something very interesting in this text that is the contradictions. This is my interpretation.
Yes.
The contradictions of the capital, or that is the same. The contradiction of the colonization is inside us. So every time that we want to close in our theory, in our speech, the contradiction, we are erasing someone.
Yes.
We are erasing the price of this colonial thinking in the reality. So I am very touched by your proposal to speech with a delay, or not speech all, but speech something to hear someone.
Yes.
And this is very beautiful. Thank you very much. I'm very excited. So I'd like to open to someone that would like to comment. I can see very potential in this speech about the contribution of Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, Gayatri Spivak, Vandana Shiva, and the conditions to teach in the schools to younger, to talk to the people on the street. This is very important to us. We will not to do revolution with this framework. And we need to move our body, I think.
Yes.
We need to go out. And I will talk a little bit more. And I think that when we talk about new ways of, new forms of living, okay, but this, we need to describe the move of our body, to do a kind of map, to describing where my body went this week. My diary, I don't know. My body went to the conference and to the very nice bar. I take a very beautiful drink, and after that I went to buy a nice one, But these show us our contradictions that we are trying to close in our mind. So to go where we don't go normally. We need to go to other side, to speak, to hear with another attunement.
Yes.
very interesting, very beautiful. Thank you. I remember the place of Chinathan.
Yes.
No, the Indian philosopher that Bell Hooks quote in the beginning of learning to transgress.
Yes.
That is the notion of compassive learning, compassive hearing, listening, compassive listening. That is a way to listen to someone without any identification. We just to hear the other. Without trying to, I leave it, I remember, I pass it like you. No, we will not understand the other. We need just to open the heart. Yes, I like that. Thank you, too.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Steve. Have the first word.
Por favor. Só para lembrar, isso, vem. We have many students that don't understand the English, so I thank you all the students that have difficulty. Eu agradeço os estudantes que estão com dificuldade de entender inglês, que eu sei que é difícil, mas a gente supera essa.
I can try to talk in English and Portuguese. Thank you for the speech. I was also very excited. I want to ask you, Professor, about, you talked about records, books, and one thing came to my mind. In the oneself as the another,
Yes.
when he talks about narrative identity, he proposed to think about people as characters, as in a novel.
Yes.
Yeah. So, do you think this could be understood in relation to Marcuse's concept of imagination? Like the relationship that Marcuse is thinking about the past, the present, and the future. So, in relation with Marcuse's thought about the past images that are present and projected to a future. This kind of narrative, identity, imaginative organization of time and identity and consciousness. And if so, what does it mean to think about people as characters in relationship with this imaginative author? The capital, because one thing, I don't know if I'm tripping here, but if you go to some specific group, I always think about like in a specific church, if we ask who is the narrator of this narrative identity, maybe God or a goddess or a different entity. In a Marxist group, the narrator is the capital. So I think about this with Marcuse, yeah, and this concept of imagination. If you think these two things can be related, then what does it mean?
Yeah, I think they can be related. So let's talk about characters in a novel for a moment. And so Marcuse is really serious about life as a text. You can read and interpret life as a text. And I think there's really something to that. I think we do that. We read life and we interpret. It's like reading a text and interpreting a text. The human life itself is a kind of text. And your life is something that you're writing, right? It's almost like when Heidegger talks about being thrown into existence. But at some point the throne becomes a thrower, or you take yourself up, right? And so in terms of novel, remember, if you're reading a literal novel, right, there's closure. But the novel, characters in the novel of human life, there is no closure, right? It's a radical openness, right? This is part of the whole notion of configuration and defiguration, right? As you go through life and you experience these events, and there's a kind of a disunity in these events, even in oneself, right? One has to, in order to move forward and to make life meaningful, create some kind of unity. So this is a telling of the story that we are as we make this unity. right? And that making of the unity includes the past in terms of Marcuse's notion of imagination and past images being projected onto the future, right? Because the past is still who we are, right? The past is not something that's gone or way back there and that's no longer, the past is no longer accessible as an event, but it is accessible in terms of it has played a role in shaping consciousness, right? It has played a role in giving one some kind of hope for the future, right? I often, when I do work on race or have certain meetings and whatnot, I often say to people, especially if it's a room full of white people who invited me there, and I know I'm the token, right? And I often say, I can't do this unless I bring my grandmothers into the room, right? I have to bring my grandmothers into the room because my grandmothers were sharecroppers. When they were young, their situation was that when you're walking down the street and you encounter a white person, you bow your head, or you step off the sidewalk and let them pass by. And I'm thinking, how can it be? These are my grandmothers are the most beautiful people I knew, wonderful, incredible, and much responsible for who I am. You know, the theory of intersubjectivity, that my subjectivity is rooted in my relationship with those people, right? And so they're dead and gone. They're the past. But I can't imagine. Well, I always remember them, but I'm still motivated by their memory. I still do certain things because of my memory of them. It's not like they're cut off. But my projected future includes them in some kind of way, even though they're gone, right? Because part of who I am is a part of the relationship that I had all those years ago. And so it's my identity. It's identity again, right? And so my identity is in some ways constituted by the relationships I've had in my life, right? And that also projects me forward. Does it make sense to you a little bit? I mean, I don't think I really hit directly, but maybe I opened a door or something.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you, Arnold, for your lecture. I have one question. How is a competition between narrative identities in a society? How can you solve these problems that you say, okay, my narrative identity has to be recognized as depressed or something like that? So you have different narratives in a society, and what is a competition and how does it come that these different narratives are recognized each other? So, I mean, it's a competition in the narrative identities. How it comes to politics, or how it comes to the same values, or how it comes to the same solidarity. I mean, that's my question.
Yeah, very good question. You know, Foucault wrote a book called Conflict of Interpretations, and so we can talk in this context. I think I may have said it in the paper, conflict of narratives. There are many narratives that are in conflict. And I think capitalism is interested in keeping those narratives in conflict with each other, right? To keep those narratives contradicting each other. But I think it will never be the case that we can simply overcome the conflict of narratives. But I think the conflict can be greatly reduced, right? And so this notion of democratic attunement that I just briefly mentioned, but didn't really say much about, or a Marcusian kind of discourse ethics, is one way of at least closing the gap between those conflicting narratives, right? So if I'm out in Kentucky and I'm talking to a poor working class Trump supporter, my focus should be at some point on hearing and listening and understanding his narrative. And as I listen to his narrative, I also begin to understand his pain, his source of pain. And it is that pain that I have to speak to. And it is in speaking to his pain that the gap between us gets smaller and we're able to have a conversation and not be in such radical competition with each other. Because, you know, like I was saying, when Georgie says these Trump people is they're just racist and that's it. No, she's ignoring the fact that they are suffering economically. And no one has attempted to reach them at that level. And if you attempt to reach them at that level, a conversation is going to develop whereby some attitudes will change as a result of that. One example of that is we had a huge a big blow up years ago about Confederate symbols and flags in the U.S. And in many places they were taking them down. And we had a big event in Lexington. You know, we had these racist statues at the courthouse. And there's actually a place called Cheapside Bar and Grill where they actually sold slaves during slavery. And the old structure is Cheapside. You can sort of see, you have the bottom floor, and then there's a balcony. And the balcony is where they paraded the slaves out, and the courtyard is where the slave owners stood and bid on the slaves and things like that. There's also an underground a tunnel where slaves would escape to and go out to the outside of the city. So they changed the name of Cheapside, changed the structure of it, took down the statues. But prior to that, the city organized a panel discussion on Confederate statues. And UK has this huge, gigantic auditorium in the new library. And they picked, I think, 6 people on the panel, 2 academics, I was one of them, 2 political leaders, and 2 local everyday people on the panel. And we laid down the rules for discussion prior to the discussion. And of course you can imagine this is Kentucky, and in that room, every view was represented. And of course, really, those who championed Confederate symbols were there. But this is the only time I think I've experienced something like this where there were so many different viewpoints, and some of them were oppressive, but where there was a peaceful conversation, and people really began to understand each other. And begin to understand why you want to get rid of Confederate symbols, and others begin to understand why you want to keep them up. And it was one of the most interesting democratic conversations I've ever been a part of. And I think that kind of thing is more possible than we think. But I can't engage or enter a conversation like that and insist on proving how theoretically correct I am, and that you've got to listen to me and buy my argument. There has to be empathy. And quite often, our conversations lack empathy. And I think empathetic conversations are the way to go. How do we do that? I don't know. I have a hard time with that too. I mean, I'm trying to develop a theory of empathy, and I struggle with it. I'll tell you the truth. The first time I ran for political office was 2018, and I was campaigning, and a guy said something to me that was racist, and I pointed it out to him, and he said it wasn't racist, and he kept on, and I cursed him out. On the campaign trail, I went up for office. I can tell you more about the story later over a beer. It actually kind of worked out for me in a strange way. But you don't do that. You run for office, don't curse the people. But I got so angry, and I couldn't empathize, right? And so even with myself, as I try to develop a so-called theory of empathy, democratic attunement, there's much work to be done on myself. I've managed to do it a few times, but then I really screwed it up there. So.
Okay, one more question. You said that the capitalism needs that there is a conflict between the narrative identities. Mm-hmm. But I think it's not only capitalism. I think every nationalism needs not only capitalism. Mm-hmm. But if you don't, who needs to regulate? If you don't can solve a conflict between the narrative identities, and you live in a society with competition from these narrative identities, what can you do? What has the society to do if this conflict is not getting violent? My question is democratic rules, democratic laws. Is there any chance to make a law that can regulate it? Not everybody is able to go into such a discourse like you do it, as an intellectual. So, but we still know that there's a narrative competition between narrative identities, and the conflict cannot be solved. Who can solve the conflict? I think it's very necessary to talk about democratic laws,
or about human rights or constitution or something like that. Because it's constitution and the laws are maybe, then I would say I'm pretty much to have Habermas, you know. We have to have democratic rules who give us a guarantee that the competition between the narrative identity is not going to get violent in the society.
Yeah, you know, at one level I agree with that. But I'm kind of pessimistic about it, right? Because, well, I mean, it seems to me there has to be some kind of transformation prior to the giving of law. Now, I'm kind of worried about what I just said too, because I mean, we do have a law that establishes certain kinds of actions and rules and so on and so forth. But the point, what worries me is that if you think about a country like the U.S., and it's not the only country, but there we see the erosion of the rule of law, a very robust erosion of the rule of law. And another thing also is one part of the Constitution that was supposed to help us have democratic discourse is free speech, right? But nobody in America knows what it means, right? Except for a handful of people. The free speech idea was created by the founding fathers because they anticipated that at some point we might have a rogue government, and citizens need to have the freedom to critique the government, keep the government in check. And they're actually getting this out of John Locke's second treatise, right? Where John Locke anticipates a rogue government and what must the citizens do when they have a rogue government. But in America, it means I can call you a racial slur and I got free speech. But if you critique the system, if you don't like it, go to another country, right? And I think that comes back to education, Marcuse's point about education. But the problem, though, is the tentacles of capitalism and nationalism are in the educational system, too. That's the problem. But it does, when somebody come back to education, because I think a fundamental education about the Constitution, what it means, and why was it written, how does it function, because Americans don't know, right? I can call you a racial slur, and that's free speech. But if you critique the present government, that's not free speech. You go to another country. Herschel Walker just recently said that. Right. Basically, I think you got me. If somebody from America may have seen the interview where if you're born after 1990, you haven't earned the right to vote. That's somebody who's running for the National Senate. But anyway, I think one thing I would like to do in terms of trying to respond to you is I think some work needs to be done with Marcuse's theory of education, because for him, in some ways, that's where the answer is, but at the same time, that's where the problem is too. You know, and I don't know, maybe one day we can have an entire conference on that and try to do some work on how to further develop this theory of education. Because for me, that's important. And I think a lot of what we are seeing around the world is, for example, I think in capitalism, capitalist society or the capitalist has an interest in making sure that the people aren't properly educated. You can't manipulate critical consciousness, right? But you can manipulate individuals that have no critical consciousness whatsoever. And so our educational system is getting more and more structured in a way that the pockets of our educational system where critical consciousness develop is being whittled down and defined.
Can I suggest something? I suspect, I'm not sure, that it would be a mistake to choice between democratic laws or without.
Yeah.
Because when I go to a school to youngers, I need the chart of UNESCO to enter there. And after I need to talk and to listen. So to me, it's not just the Habermas and not just bell hooks, but the both. And to do what you need. Yes, I feel that my experience discussing gender and racism inside the schools. And another subject for you that is we need to learn machines, the law. We need to learn because machine will the artificial intelligence need to learn this kind of language of law to discuss with machines.
Yes.
But this is another subject. But it's just an example that we need to talk.
Yeah.
Yes, nice. Yes. Is that okay?
That's it.
Yes. Okay. Yes. But I would like just to finish remembering that the notion of peaceful conversation that Arnold presented to us remind me the first ethical word that is ahimsa. Ahimsa is the expression used by Gandhi, but not exactly Gandhi, much before, 4,000 before. That is the notion of non-violence, but in a positive sense. Without ahimsa, I can't work in a school. I can organize in my classroom. Autonomous democratic. So your speech is very interesting in counterpoint. So it's not about your violence, but ahimsa. That's the ethical point to discuss politics in contextual situation. I think that with your speech, I'd like to close this session, and thank you very much.
Thank you.